Is everybody good? Everybody can hear me? All right, so good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chris Grogan. I'm Public Affairs Officer for U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Thanks for joining us today to talk about the legalization of marijuana in Canada and how it's going to affect travelers coming across our ports here in the United States. Speaking today is going to be the Director of Field Operations, Christopher Perry. Proper spelling of his name is Christopher, last name Perry, Perry, and his title is Director of Field Operations, and he is in charge of the entire state of Michigan. Also joining us today are our federal partners, Deputy Special Agent in Charge Angie Salazar from Homeland Security Investigations, Executive Officer Patrick Ashworth from the U.S. Border Patrol, the Assistant Director of Field Operations Andrew Douglas from the Detroit Field Office, as well as Marty Raybon, who is the Port Director for Detroit. After Mr. Perry's conducted his remarks this morning, we'll open it up for questions. I'll jump back in to kind of moderate that. The one thing I want to stress, though, is we're not going to be answering any hypothetical questions, okay? So if you have those, just try to not ask those. But we can't answer hypotheticals because everything comes down to the instance at hand. So without further ado, Mr. Perry.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Christopher Perry. I'm the Director of Field Operations for U.S. Customs and Border Protection's Detroit Field Office. I'm responsible for the entire state of Michigan, to include the major border crossings at Detroit, Port Huron, Sault Ste. Marie, and the Detroit Metropolitan Airport. As you're all aware, we're here today to discuss the legalization of marijuana that went into effect in Canada earlier this morning. As this has now been implemented, I believe it's important that we continue to educate and inform travelers of the laws when crossing into the United States from Canada or other countries that may have legalized marijuana. U.S. Customs and Border Protection enforces the laws of the United States, and the U.S. laws have not changed following Canada's legalization of marijuana today. Requirements for international travelers wishing to enter the United States are governed by and conducted in accordance with U.S. federal law, which supersedes state laws. Although medical and recreational marijuana may be legal in some U.S. states and Canada, the sale, possession, production, and distribution of marijuana or the facilitation of the aforementioned remain illegal under U.S. federal law. So consequently crossing the border or arriving at a U.S. port of entry in violation of law may result in denied admission, seizure, fines, and apprehension. U.S. CBP officers are thoroughly trained on admissibility factors and the Immigration and Nationality Act, which governs the admissibility of travelers into the United States. Determinations about admissibility and whether any regulatory or criminal enforcement is appropriate are made by CBP officers based on the facts of the inspection and the circumstances known to the officer at the time. Generally, any arriving alien who is determined to be a drug abuser or addict, or who is convicted of, admits having committed, or admits committing acts which constitute the essential elements of a violation or an attempt or conspiracy to violate any law or regulation of a state, the United States, or a foreign country related to controlled substances is inadmissible to the United States. Furthermore, a Canadian citizen working in or facilitating the proliferation of the legal marijuana industry in Canada coming to the U.S. for reasons unrelated to the marijuana industry will generally be admissible to the United States. However, if a traveler is found to be coming to the U.S. for reasons related to the marijuana industry, they may be deemed inadmissible. Our CBP officers are the nation's first line of defense in preventing the illegal importation of narcotics, including marijuana, into the United States. In closing, I would like to reiterate that the U.S. federal law that prohibits the importation of marijuana has not changed, and U.S. CBP officers will continue to enforce those laws that remain unchanged. Thank you, and at this point I'll be open to answer any questions.
So we'll start it on this side and we'll just go around and we'll go back. So anyone starts, any questions? All right, go ahead, ma'am.
Could you further explain what you mean by if a U.S. traveler is coming to the U.S. in relation to marijuana, they may be deemed inadmissible? Could you explain that a little bit more, please?
It wouldn't be a U.S. traveler, a Canadian traveler. U.S. citizens, would not. We would not refuse a U.S. citizen's entry to the United States. It would be a Canadian or a foreign national.
What do you mean about in relation to marijuana?
Marijuana is illegal federally in the United States, so the use, sale, production, distribution could render someone inadmissible to the United States, based on an assessment of the totality of the facts of the case presented to the officer.
As of today, marijuana use is legal in Canada. Somebody coming across, a Canadian coming to the U.S. is asked if they've ever consumed marijuana. If they reply in the affirmative, will they be allowed through?
It's a case-by-case decision based on what's presented to the officer. Yes, ma'am.
What kinds of questions are you going to be asking at the border?
Okay. The questions that we asked yesterday are basically the same questions that we're going to be asking today, and we generally are not asking routine questions about people's, marijuana use.
What happens if the ballot proposal here in Michigan passes on November 6th?
Okay. Nothing changes. U.S. It is illegal, to possess, sell, distribute, marijuana, in the United States, and federal law will not change. Federal law supersedes state law. Yes, sir.
How do you expect this is going to affect traffic across the border at different crossings? Is this going to end up slowing up the border crossings because you're going to have to be doing additional questioning of people and also taking additional people aside?
Right. I mean, as I said a moment ago, what happened yesterday is happening today. We're experiencing currently no negative impact at the border related to this, and we don't anticipate any negative impact. It could result in some additional inspections, but again, we're not anticipating any negative impact.
Can you go into detail about the penalties, the possible penalties for those
Right.
various violations?
Okay. Penalties could involve, seizure. They could involve financial penalties. But again, it's based on the totality of the circumstances that are presented to the officer.
Currently, our federal border minister has said that 1 in 8 Canadians are consumers of marijuana. Our Statistics Canada has said that up to 5 million or more Canadians will be trying cannabis between now and the end of the year. I'm just wondering, at what point when Canadians come to the border will they be asked questions about cannabis use? Is it strictly during secondary inspection, or will it be at primary as well?
It could be at the primary inspection, but again, we don't anticipate asking routine questions about marijuana use. But depending on what is communicated to the officer at the time of the primary inspection would determine the line of questioning. And CBP officers have broad discretion on the types of questions they could ask in primary or secondary.
So when a U.S. traveler comes back from Canada, I know sometimes you ask if you have any alcohol receipt or whatever, or say you have the alcohol or marijuana.
A U.S. CBP officer could ask those types of questions because, again, they have broad discretion as to what they can ask. But we're not generally asking routine questions about marijuana use.
Would there have to be something in the behavior of the motorist that prompts those types of questions, or is it just random selection of who gets those types of questions?
Generally we're asking questions for a particular purpose. So it could be the behavior of a traveler. It could be the result of a canine alert on a vehicle if there's any type of residue or odor. But again, the officer, depending on the circumstances, does have broad discretion to ask the questions that he or she feels necessary.
You're not saying a Michigan citizen can't go over to Canada and smoke pot, right?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
You say, can a Michigan citizen go over to Canada and smoke pot?
I can't comment on what a Michigan citizen can do. If it's legal under Canadian law for a Michigan citizen to do that, then they would be able to do that. But again, coming back to the United States, it is illegal.
Could a Michigan citizen take marijuana over?
That is a question that's probably best geared toward Canada Border Services Agency, but in general, the transportation of marijuana to Canada and from Canada to the U.S. would be illegal in both countries.
On a daily, weekly, monthly basis, how many arrests do you normally do for cannabis?
Very few. In the last several years, I can say that very, very small numbers. For travelers.
If a Michigan resident can go to Canada, consume pot, come back home again, what about the Canadians who are doing something that's perfectly legal there? Why would they be prohibited from visiting the U.S. and doing what they normally do, which is going to a sports game or going out for dinner in Detroit?
Well, because under federal law, the use of illegal narcotics, to include marijuana, is illegal. And whether you're a U.S. citizen or a Canadian citizen coming back to the border, you would still be subject to the same requirement. That is, you can't possess it. If you've smoked marijuana, and we believe that there would be marijuana in a car, a U.S. citizen would be subject to secondary inspection and the potential for prosecution, depending on the totality of the circumstances.
But if they've simply gone over and consumed and now they're returning with nothing on them, nothing they can
But I think it goes off the response of not coming to the United States for the marijuana industry, if they're just coming over for travel.
Right. All right, so if an individual is coming to the United States, like say a Canadian is coming to the United States, and it has nothing to do with the marijuana industry or the proliferation of the industry, that person would generally be deemed admissible to the United States. If they're coming to the United States, a Canadian citizen with the express interest to facilitate or develop the marijuana industry, they would generally be deemed inadmissible. Sure.
What if that Canadian citizen wanted to go visit Colorado or Washington State and say, well, I'm going to go there, pot is legal, I'm going to try some, be a tourist?
Right. Federal law supersedes state law in the United States, so it would be illegal federally, for anyone to enter the United States, with marijuana.
Are you changing any apparatus at the border? When I say apparatus, I mean more dogs or anything or any procedures that you've been using yesterday that today you'll be changing just so that you can keep an eye on whether or not people are coming across.
What we were doing yesterday is exactly the same thing that we're doing today. So nothing has changed at the border since Canada has legalized marijuana.
Right now in Ontario, you can only buy it online. Come April, they're looking at making storefronts. Would there be more, I guess, a greater concern come springtime, in the sense that someone can go to a storefront, bring it back over?
I mean, for our purposes, I mean, we're concerned about what occurs, at the border. So we're gonna be, equally concerned, whether it's the mail or, it's storefronts. It is illegal to transport marijuana into the United States.
But again, just to be clear, if a Michigan citizen has marijuana and it's legal, it becomes legal here, and they take it across the border in a country that is legal, you're saying that's still not allowed because we catch it at the border, it's federal laws versus state laws, so they're not allowed to.
That is correct. Even if it is legal in a state in the United States, or it becomes legal at some point in Michigan, it would be illegal federally.
Could some of the questions that are asked go pre-legalization and post-legalization?
Yes, they could, and that's why I say that the totality of the circumstances presented to the officer will help us determine if someone is admissible into the United States or not.
All right, I think that'll wrap it up for Mr. Perry. For those that want to get some B-roll, you guys want to go down here in just a few minutes so you guys can gather some B-roll of primary and stuff like that. And if you got any follow-on questions, email me or give me a call. You guys all have my info. But thanks for everybody for coming out, Mr. Perry.
Thank you.
All right. If you want to head back in,
Good job.
Thank you so much.
Channel 7. Thank you.
Great.